It was a bleak, icy morning in Chicago when Margaret Johnson, a frail 74-year-old woman, arrived at the city's overburdened public hospital. The biting wind stung her cheeks as she hobbled through the automatic doors, clutching a thin scarf tightly around her neck. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed coldly overhead, and the waiting room was crowded with people, most of whom wore the same weary expression. Margaret's arthritis made every step painful, but that wasn't what concerned her today. She had felt an odd pressure in her chest for days, and though she tried to dismiss it, her worsening fatigue and shortness of breath left her no choice but to seek medical help. The hospital itself was a reflection of a healthcare system straining under pressure, its staff running on empty and its resources stretched thin. Margaret, like many others, had waited weeks for an appointment, and her arrival was anything but timely. She looked around the waiting room, noticing the faces of those sitting beside her. Mothers with crying babies, elderly men dozing off in their wheelchairs, a young man holding his arm tightly in pain. The hospital was a lifeline for people who had nowhere else to go. After hours of waiting, her name was finally called. She slowly rose, her knees creaking in protest. "Mrs. Johnson?" a nurse said, not looking up from her clipboard. Margaret followed her into the bowels of the hospital, past crowded hallways, and into a sterile exam room. The beeping of machines and the hurried footsteps of the staff echoed all around her, and Margaret felt a sense of unease growing in her chest. This was the place people came when they were at their most vulnerable, but there was no warmth here, no sense of humanity. Margaret sat on the exam table, nervously clutching the thin paper gown they had given her, wondering if anyone would truly listen to her today. Dr. Emily Thompson entered the exam room with brisk, hurried steps, barely glancing at Margaret as she scanned the chart in her hand. In her early 30s, Emily was already worn down by the relentless pace of the hospital. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her once pristine white coat now had a few coffee stains and ink marks, small symbols of the chaos she lived daily. She had been on shift for nearly 12 hours, and the pressure of seeing patient after patient had dulled her empathy over time. Today was no different. "Mrs. Johnson," Emily began, flipping through the medical notes, her tone clipped. "What seems to be the problem?" Margaret's voice trembled as she tried to explain her symptoms. "I've been feeling this pressure in my chest, and, well, I'm always so tired. It's been getting worse for a few days, and Emily cut her off. "Chest pressure, fatigue. Got it. Have you had a heart condition before?" Her eyes never left the chart, as if the woman in front of her was merely another case to file away. "No, not really, but my father had heart problems and I'm worried." "Right." Emily typed something into the computer. "We'll run a few tests. In the meantime, I'll prescribe something to help with the symptoms." Her tone was mechanical, devoid of the warmth that Margaret desperately needed at that moment. The older woman opened her mouth to ask another question, but Emily was already halfway out the door. "Wait." Margaret's voice was soft but urgent. "Is it serious? Should I be worried?" Emily paused, her hand on the door handle. "It's probably nothing. We'll see after the tests," she said dismissively, before stepping out into the hallway and moving on to the next patient. Margaret sat alone in the sterile room, a growing sense of helplessness creeping into her chest. She had been brushed aside, like so many others who passed through this overcrowded hospital. In that moment, the institution felt more like a machine than a place of healing. Emily's indifference was a symptom of a system that had worn down even its most well-meaning doctors. Margaret sighed, looking at the clock on the wall. She had come hoping for answers, but left with only more questions. The following day, Margaret picked up the prescription Dr. Emily had hurriedly written for her, a common medication for indigestion and mild discomfort. Despite her reservations, she took it as directed, hoping it would ease the pressure in her chest. But over the next few hours, her symptoms worsened. The dull pressure morphed into sharp, stabbing pains, and a sense of dizziness clouded her mind. As she lay on her couch, gasping for air, she wondered if coming to the hospital had been a mistake. Dr. Emily, now back at the hospital for another grueling shift, had barely given Margaret's case a second thought. Between administrative meetings and her relentless patient load, Margaret was just one more name on an endless list. Emily had become used to seeing people as diagnoses and symptoms, rather than as individuals with complex lives. The exhaustion made it easier to distance herself, to detach emotionally. She told herself she was just being efficient. Later that afternoon, as Emily skimmed through patient files, a nurse rushed over with a look of concern. "Dr. Thompson, do you remember the elderly woman from yesterday? Margaret Johnson?" Emily barely recalled the interaction. "Vaguely," she replied, eyes still glued to her computer screen. "She's back. Her daughter called an ambulance. She's in bad shape, worsening chest pain, shortness of breath, and now she's unresponsive. It doesn't look good." For a moment, Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but she quickly brushed it aside. "I prescribed her something for mild indigestion. She probably didn't follow the instructions properly." The nurse frowned. "But what if it's more serious? The symptoms sound like a heart issue." Emily's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her professional mask slipping slightly. She knew she hadn't given Margaret the attention she deserved. She hadn't asked enough questions, hadn't explored the possibilities beyond the surface-level symptoms. Her prescription was based on a rushed assumption, and now it was coming back to haunt her. At that moment, Emily felt a rare pang of guilt, but she swallowed it, as she often did. "Let's just stabilize her for now," she said, standing up, her voice firm. But deep down, she knew the gravity of her oversight. Margaret had trusted her, and she had failed. Meanwhile, Margaret lay in a hospital bed once again, this time surrounded by machines monitoring her weakening body. The heart attack she feared had been growing for days, and with every passing minute, the consequences of Emily's indifference became more apparent. Margaret's condition was far worse than a simple case of indigestion, something that might have been caught had Emily looked beyond the surface. When Margaret was rushed back into the hospital, her condition had deteriorated significantly. The paramedics wheeled her into the emergency room, her frail body limp and unresponsive. The sharp beeps of the heart monitor filled the room, creating a tense atmosphere as the medical team gathered around. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Ethan Reynolds, a young but sharp and compassionate physician known for his thoroughness and deep sense of empathy. Ethan, in his early 30s, was still idealistic, despite the demanding environment he worked in. His eyes, bright with a determination to make a difference, scanned Margaret's chart quickly before moving toward her. The staff around him whispered about her condition. It was the medication, completely wrong for her symptoms. One of the nurses murmured under her breath. He frowned, kneeling beside Margaret's bed. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow. He immediately saw the gravity of the situation. "We need an ECG and blood tests immediately," he ordered, his voice calm but authoritative. The team moved swiftly, following his commands. As the machines whirred to life, Ethan's focus remained on Margaret. He could tell by the results trickling in that her situation was critical, a likely heart attack, which had gone unnoticed until it was nearly too late. His jaw clenched with frustration. How could this have been missed? He asked one of the nurses for the details of her earlier visit, and his face darkened as he read the previous notes from Dr. Emily. "This prescription," he muttered under his breath, his frustration rising. It was completely inappropriate for someone showing these kinds of symptoms. Ethan was known for his bedside manner, and now, he gently placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, as if to reassure her that she was no longer just another case. "You're going to be okay, Mrs. Johnson. I'm here, and I won't let anything else slip by." Margaret's daughter, Sarah, rushed into the room, her face pale with worry. She stopped at the sight of her mother lying there, connected to tubes and machines. "What happened? Why is she like this?" Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. Ethan turned to her, maintaining his calm demeanor. "We're still assessing her condition, but it looks like there was an oversight in her previous treatment." He hesitated, not wanting to place blame just yet. But the truth was unavoidable. "We're doing everything we can now. I promise." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "She trusted you people. She came here because she thought this place would help her," she said, her voice quivering. Ethan nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I'm sorry. I'm going to make sure we get this right from now on," Ethan said softly, but with a firmness that reassured her. His dedication and empathy radiated, a stark contrast to the indifference Margaret had experienced before. Ethan stayed by Margaret's side as the team worked, his mind racing through every possible step he could take to stabilize her condition. This wasn't just another patient. This was someone who had been let down by the system, and he wouldn't allow her to be failed again. Later that evening, the tension in the hospital hallways was palpable. Dr. Ethan Reynolds had just finished a grueling round of assessments on Margaret Johnson, her condition now critical but stabilized. He had done everything in his power to reverse the damage caused by the wrong prescription, but the reality was clear. Time had been lost, and Margaret's recovery was now in jeopardy. As Ethan made his way toward the staff room to grab a quick coffee, he crossed paths with Dr. Emily Thompson. She was rushing through the corridor, her head buried in a stack of charts, but Ethan stopped her abruptly. "Emily, we need to talk." Ethan's tone was firm, but not loud, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Emily looked up, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and annoyance. "Can it wait? I'm swamped right now." "It can't," Ethan responded sharply, taking a step closer to her, lowering his voice so the passing nurses couldn't hear. "It's about Margaret Johnson, the elderly woman you saw yesterday." Emily frowned, clearly struggling to recall. "What about her?" "She's the patient who came in with chest pressure and fatigue, the one you prescribed meds for indigestion. She's had a heart attack. We barely caught it in time." Emily's face went pale for a moment, but she quickly hardened her expression, as if building an emotional wall to defend herself. "I followed the protocol based on what she told me. It could have been anything. You know we don't have time to do a full workup on every single patient that walks through here," she retorted, her voice defensive. Ethan's frustration boiled over. "That's the problem, Emily. You didn't listen. You rushed through her symptoms like she was just another case file, and now she's fighting for her life. This isn't just about protocol. It's about paying attention, about doing the job we signed up for." Emily's eyes flashed with a mix of guilt and defiance. "Don't act like you're the only one who cares, Ethan. I've been pulling double shifts for months, seeing more patients than anyone here. We're all overworked." Ethan shook his head, his voice calm but insistent. "I'm not blaming you for being tired. I'm blaming you for losing touch with why we're here. Margaret deserved better than a quick dismissal and a careless prescription. She needed you to care, even if just for 5 minutes." Emily stood there, silent, for a moment. The weight of Ethan's words began to sink in, and though her instinct was to argue, she couldn't. The truth was, she knew deep down she had let Margaret slip through the cracks. Her exhaustion had numbed her to the urgency of her patient's needs, and now someone was suffering because of it. "You think I don't know that?" Emily finally muttered, her voice cracking slightly, betraying her usual tough exterior. "You think I don't feel that weight every day?" Ethan softened, but his stance remained firm. "Then do something about it. We all feel it, but you can't let it push you into autopilot. Margaret is someone's mother, someone's grandmother. You need to remember that." Emily's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from her. She looked away, unable to meet Ethan's eyes, and nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of her mistake. "I'll check on her," Emily said quietly, her voice subdued. Ethan watched her walk away, feeling the tension in his own chest ease slightly. He knew this confrontation wouldn't change everything overnight, but perhaps it would be the first step toward her rediscovering the compassion that had led her to medicine in the first place. As the clock in the emergency room ticked closer to midnight, Sarah Johnson rushed through the hospital doors, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother's health had always been fragile, but hearing that she had been rushed back to the hospital in such a critical condition sent waves of fear surging through her. Sarah had dropped everything. The pile of work on her desk, the phone call with a client, and had driven straight to the hospital. She could barely remember the drive. Only the gnawing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. The ER was bustling with activity, but Sarah's world felt narrowed to one focus: finding her mother. She spotted a nurse near the reception desk and rushed over. "Margaret Johnson. Where is she?" "Please, I'm her daughter," Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The nurse, recognizing the urgency in her voice, quickly checked the records. "She's in room 306, ICU," the nurse replied softly. "A doctor will come to talk to you shortly." Without waiting for further instruction, Sarah made her way down the sterile, cold hallways of the ICU. Every step felt heavy, and every passing minute intensified her worry. When she finally reached room 306, her breath caught in her throat at the sight of her mother. Margaret lay on the hospital bed, connected to machines, her face pale and worn. The faint beeping of the heart monitor filled the air, a constant reminder of how fragile her condition was. "Mom!" Sarah whispered as she approached the bed, her voice breaking. She reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently, hoping for some kind of response. But Margaret remained still, her chest rising and falling slowly with the aid of the machines. Just then, Dr. Ethan Reynolds entered the room, his expression compassionate but serious. He had seen this before: the fear in the eyes of loved ones, the overwhelming helplessness that followed these kinds of medical crises. "Are you Sarah?" he asked softly, standing at the foot of the bed. Sarah nodded, her eyes still fixed on her mother. "What happened? Why is she like this?" There was an edge to her voice, a mixture of confusion, fear, and anger. "She came here yesterday, and they sent her home. Why wasn't she taken care of then?" Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother was seen by a doctor yesterday, but it seems there was a misjudgment in her diagnosis. She was given medication for a condition she didn't have, and unfortunately, her real issue, her heart, was missed. She had a heart attack earlier today." Sarah's face turned white, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. "A misjudgment? How could they get something like this wrong?" Her voice rose, laced with disbelief. "She came here for help, and now she's—" Her voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan stepped closer, his tone steady but empathetic. "I know this is incredibly hard to hear, and you have every right to be upset. We're doing everything we can now to stabilize her, but I'm afraid time was lost." Sarah turned toward Ethan, her eyes full of anger and grief. "How could this happen? She trusted you people." Her voice shook as she struggled to contain her emotions. Ethan nodded, his face etched with genuine regret. "I can't change what happened before, but I'm here now, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she gets the care she needs." Sarah wiped away the tears welling in her eyes, her emotions shifting between anger and despair. "I don't know if that's enough," she whispered, turning back to look at her mother. The room fell silent, the only sound the steady beep of the machines, as Sarah stood by her mother's side, feeling as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The ICU room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of the machines keeping Margaret stable. Sarah sat by her mother's bedside, her hand resting on Margaret's fragile fingers, lost in thought. The anger she had felt earlier was still there, but now it was joined by an overwhelming sadness. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there when the door opened quietly and Dr. Emily Thompson walked in. Emily stood by the door for a moment, her usual briskness replaced by a hesitancy Sarah hadn't seen before. Sarah looked up, her eyes narrowing. She immediately recognized Emily from her mother's description of the doctor who had treated her the day before. The tension in the room thickened. "Ms. Johnson," Emily began softly, taking a few steps closer. "I'm Dr. Thompson. I was the one who saw your mother yesterday." Sarah's face hardened. "I know who you are." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "You're the one who let her walk out of here when she was already sick." Emily winced at the accusation, But she didn't retreat. She had prepared herself for this, knowing it was the least she deserved. "I'm here to apologize," she said, her voice steady but filled with remorse. "I made a mistake. I didn't give your mother the attention she needed. And I'm so sorry." For a moment, Sarah didn't respond. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "Sorry," Sarah finally said, her voice trembling with emotion. "My mother is lying in that bed because you didn't take her seriously. Sorry doesn't fix this." Emily nodded, her eyes cast down in shame. "You're right," she admitted. "It doesn't. But I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to help from here on out." "I owe her that." There was a long, strained pause. Sarah looked at Emily, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. But there was something else too, something familiar in Emily's face. A vague memory began to stir in the back of Sarah's mind, a connection she couldn't quite place. "Wait a minute," Sarah said, her brow furrowed. "Thompson? That's your last name?" Emily nodded, confused by the sudden shift. "Yes, why?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned on her. "Did you grow up near Oak Park? On Maple Avenue?" Emily blinked, taken aback. "I did. Why?" Sarah's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. "I knew a girl with the last name Thompson when I was a kid. We used to play together. Your family moved away when we were in middle school, right?" Emily's eyes widened as she, too, began to realize the connection. "Oh my God. Sarah? Sarah Johnson?" A stunned silence filled the room as the two women stared at each other, the weight of their shared past suddenly thrust into the present. Memories of childhood afternoons spent riding bikes, playing tag, and laughing without a care in the world flooded back. They hadn't seen each other in decades, but now, under these tragic circumstances, their paths had crossed again. "I can't believe this," Sarah muttered, shaking her head. "You were my best friend back then." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. The realization that she had not only failed a patient, but someone connected to her past made the situation even more painful. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah's anger softened, if only slightly, as the memories of their childhood played in her mind. But the pain of the present was still too raw. "It doesn't change what happened," she said quietly. "But maybe it changes how I feel about you." Emily nodded, her voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry, Sarah, for everything." Sarah didn't respond immediately, but the intensity in her gaze had dimmed. The weight of their shared history made the present moment even more complex, leaving both women unsure of what to say next. But in that silence, there was the faintest glimmer of understanding, of a connection that might not heal the past, but could, perhaps, soften its edges. That night, after the emotional encounter with Sarah, Dr. Emily Thompson sat alone in the hospital's break room. The cold, sterile atmosphere felt suffocating as the hum of vending machines buzzed in the background. The events of the past 24 hours replayed over and over in her mind. The rushed consultation with Margaret, the confrontation with Ethan, and then the unexpected revelation of her childhood connection with Sarah. Emily felt a heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. It was the weight of regret, and it sat deep in her bones. For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to stop to really think about what had happened. She stared blankly at the plastic cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands, her thoughts drifting back to when she first decided to become a doctor. Back then, it had been more than just a profession. It was a calling. She remembered being a young medical student, full of idealism and passion. She had entered medicine wanting to change the world, to heal people, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, that spark had dimmed. The long shifts, the endless paperwork, the constant pressure, all of it had taken its toll. The hospital had turned into a machine, and Emily, like so many others, had become part of its routine. The patients had become cases, numbers, and tasks to be completed. She hadn't even realized how far she had drifted from her original purpose until now. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she dismissed Margaret's symptoms, barely taking the time to listen to the elderly woman. How had she become so disconnected from the human side of medicine? Margaret's face haunted her. The fear in her eyes, the quiet plea for someone to really see her. Emily had ignored that plea, and now Margaret lay in the ICU, fighting for her life. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't check it. Instead, she leaned back in the chair, her eyes closing for a moment. The hospital's lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls, and in that silence, Emily was left alone with her thoughts. She remembered her early days as an intern, how she would stay late just to talk to patients, to make sure they felt heard. She thought of her mentors who had taught her the importance of compassion and care. They had always said, medicine isn't just about diagnosing diseases, it's about treating people. Somewhere along the line, Emily had lost that focus. She had let the overwhelming demands of the job numb her. The image of Sarah, standing by her mother's bed, flashed in her mind again. The look of betrayal in Sarah's eyes stung the most. Sarah had trusted the hospital, trusted her, and Emily had let both of them down. The fact that they had once been friends, that they had shared so much history, made it even more painful. Emily couldn't shake the thought that if she had taken just a little more time, if she had asked just a few more questions, this all might have been avoided. I used to be better than this, Emily whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the empty room. But regrets were heavy, and Emily knew that dwelling on them wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was what she did next. She couldn't undo what had happened to Margaret, but she could make sure it never happened again. She could reconnect with the doctor she had once been, the one who cared deeply, who listened, who took the time to see the person behind the illness. With a deep breath, Emily stood up. The exhaustion of the day still weighed on her, but there was a newfound clarity in her mind. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and that making amends wouldn't erase the past. But it was a start. As she walked back toward the ICU, Emily made a silent vow to herself. She would be there for Margaret, for Sarah, for every patient who walked through those hospital doors. No more autopilot. No more rushing through lives. She would rediscover the doctor she once was, the doctor she knew she could still be. The next morning, Emily returned to the hospital with a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret's condition had stabilized overnight, thanks to Dr. Ethan Reynolds' intervention. But the gravity of the situation lingered, and Emily knew that her next conversation with Sarah would be pivotal. The tension between them weighed heavily on her mind as she walked toward Margaret's ICU room. When she entered the room, she found Sarah sitting by her mother's side, just as she had been the night before. Margaret's fragile body was still hooked up to machines, her breathing steady but shallow. The room was quiet, except for the beeping of the monitors. Sarah glanced up as Emily walked in, her expression guarded but less hostile than before. "Sarah," Emily began, her voice soft but steady. "I know that no words can undo what happened, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I didn't listen to your mother the way I should have. I didn't treat her with the care she deserved, and that's on me. I failed her, and I failed you." Sarah didn't respond right away. Her eyes, red from lack of sleep, flickered with a mix of emotions: anger, hurt, and something else, something softer. She looked down at her mother's hand, still holding it gently. I can't believe this happened. I trusted you all." "She trusted you," Sarah said, her voice cracking. Emily took a step closer, her own guilt almost too heavy to bear. "I know, and I know that saying sorry won't fix what happened, but I want to make things right as much as I can. I'm not just apologizing. I'm going to make sure that no one else goes through this. I've lost sight of what brought me into this profession, but I'm trying to change that now." Sarah looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. The anger that had been so sharp before seemed to be softening, replaced by a deep sadness. "You used to care," she said quietly. "I remember when we were kids. You were always the one who looked out for everyone. How did you lose that?" Emily swallowed hard. "I lost myself in all of this," she admitted. In the long hours, the constant pressure, I stopped seeing people the way I should. But it's a wake-up call for me. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to earn back your trust. And I promise I'll do better. For your mom, for you, and for every patient I see. For a moment, Sarah remained silent, her gaze shifting between her mother and Emily. The tension hung thick in the air, the weight of the unspoken words between them almost palpable. I don't know if I can forgive you right away, Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I can see that you mean it. I can see that you're trying. And I guess that's a start. Emily felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest, relief mixed with sorrow. She nodded, accepting Sarah's words for what they were. Not full forgiveness, but a step toward it. Thank you, Emily said softly, her voice trembling slightly. That means a lot. And I promise, I'll be here every step of the way. For whatever your mother needs. Just then, Margaret stirred slightly in her bed, her fingers twitching ever so faintly in Sarah's hand. Both women froze, their eyes immediately locking onto Margaret's face. It was a small movement, but it was a sign of hope, a sign that she was fighting her way back. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was a flicker of something else. Hope. She glanced at Emily, and for the first time, there was no anger in her gaze, just a shared understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of holding on to the moments that mattered. We're in this together now, Sarah said quietly, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. For my mom, Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. For your mom, she echoed, feeling the weight of her responsibility, but also the possibility of redemption. In that moment, the air between them shifted, no longer filled with blame and bitterness, but with the beginnings of understanding and maybe, just maybe, the path toward forgiveness. The days that followed were slow but hopeful. Margaret, though still weak, showed small signs of improvement with each passing hour. Dr. Ethan Reynolds continued to oversee her care with his usual diligence, ensuring every test and treatment was conducted with precision. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Thompson visited Margaret daily, not only as a physician, but as someone making amends for her past mistake. She sat quietly at Margaret's bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest, feeling the weight of her responsibility, but also the possibility of healing, not just for Margaret, but for herself. Sarah was a constant presence as well. She had moved past the initial shock and anger and was now focused entirely on her mother's recovery. Though the road ahead was uncertain, there was a new sense of unity between her and Emily. While they weren't back to the easy friendship they once had as children, there was a mutual respect and understanding that had taken root. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the blinds in Margaret's room, bathing everything in a soft golden light, Margaret stirred more noticeably. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she whispered, "Sarah?" Sarah was at her side in an instant, her heart leaping with relief. "Mom, I'm here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." Margaret's hand squeezed Sarah's, weak but purposeful. Her eyes shifted slightly, finding Emily standing nearby. There was a flicker of recognition in her tired eyes, and though she was still too weak to speak more, there was a peacefulness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Emily took a tentative step forward. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm so glad to see you awake," she said softly. There was no need for more words. Margaret didn't need to know all the details of what had happened. She only needed to know that she was now in good hands. As the days went on, Margaret continued to improve. The heart attack had been a close call, but with the right care and attention, she was slowly but surely getting stronger. Sarah spent every possible moment by her mother's side, grateful for each small victory, each day that brought her mother back to her. One evening, as Margaret rested, Sarah and Emily sat together in the hospital's small cafeteria. The tension between them had long since eased, replaced by a quiet camaraderie. They shared stories of their childhood, reminiscing about summers spent playing in their old neighborhood. The connection they had rediscovered felt like a thread that had been frayed, but never truly broken. "You know," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful, "I never thought I'd be sitting here with you again, especially not under these circumstances." Emily smiled softly. "Neither did I, but I'm glad we are. I think I needed this, not just to make things right with your mom, but to remind myself why I became a doctor in the first place." Sarah nodded. "It's been a hard few days, but I can see you're different now, Emily. You're trying." Emily took a deep breath, her smile fading slightly as she looked down at her hands. "I lost my way for a while. I was so caught up in the pressure, in the routine, that I forgot why I started. But your mom," she reminded me. "She brought me back to what matters." Sarah reached out, placing her hand on Emily's arm. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. And you've done more than enough to show that you care." Emily looked up, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Margaret was discharged a few weeks later, her strength slowly returning with the help of physical therapy and ongoing medical care. As she left the hospital, Sarah by her side, Emily and Ethan stood at the entrance, watching them go. There was a sense of closure in the air, a feeling that, despite the pain and mistakes, something good had come from it all. For Emily, the experience had been transformative. She returned to her practice with a renewed sense of purpose, making a conscious effort to connect with each patient, to listen more, and to never let the system rob her of her humanity again. She knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but she had found her way back to the doctor she had once been, the one who cared deeply and saw each patient as a person, not just a case. Sarah and Emily's paths would cross again, occasionally over coffee or an unexpected visit. The bond they had rebuilt, fragile though it was, served as a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of staying connected to what really mattered. In the end, Margaret's ordeal had changed all of them, not just in the obvious ways, but in the quieter, deeper ways that stay with you long after the crisis has passed. It had taught them all the value of compassion, the strength found in vulnerability, and the importance of always being present for those who need you most. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and watch this next story. It's truly moving.